This is the second part of a presentation about alphabet evolution, in which the first part described some processes behind the development of the Phoenician alphabet into the ancient Aramaic and Greek alphabets. Parts 2 and 3 will look at what happened after that, starting with the Aramaic and Greek alphabets and following them into the modern Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, Roman, and Cyrillic alphabets. In Part 3, I'll go through each of the 22 letters one by one. But before I get started on that, I need to talk about a few general patterns that we'll see affecting multiple letters apiece to save some time later. And the biggest one is capitalization and lowercaseification. This table only shows Greek's capital letters, but we do need to consider lowercase letters and the relationship between the two cases because sometimes capital letters are affected by the same things that created lowercase, or the two cases can interact with each other, or a single shape can move from one case to the other. And although Semitic alphabets don't have capital and lowercase letters, the way the difference between the cases originated also manifests in the Semitic alphabets, just not in the same way. Originally, when the only ways to draw letters were physically harder to do, like gouging or pressing into clay or wax or carving in stone, there was less reason to let their shapes change because it would be roughly equally hard work in any shape. So there was usually only one form of each letter in any given alphabet, generally equivalent to what we now call capital letters. But as writing with a pen on paper or parchment took over, some letters started taking on different shapes in Greek depending on whether they were being done in one of the old hard ways or the new easy way. Writing with a pen allowed them to go faster and write longer volumes, and the more of that they did, the more easily their handwriting could get rushed and sloppy. At first, the different versions of each letter worked more like what we would now call font faces, not our modern idea of capital and lowercase, because they did not mix. Each document or artifact used only one version, so roughly speaking, there was one style for monuments and another for manuscripts. But then some people started throwing in a few of the monumental type in their manuscripts, along with making them bigger and different colors wherever they wanted one letter to stand out from the rest. At first, there were no consistent rules about doing that, but that's what developed into our current practice of writing mostly in lowercase with a few capitals. For a closer look at how the two separated, we'll start with a focus on alpha, for which the capital and lowercase forms might seem at first to be unrelated to each other. It was one of the last and slowest letters to shift away from its Phoenician shape. Even after something close to its modern standard Greek shape appeared, that coexisted with versions which still retained Phoenician traits for hundreds of years before the more Phoenician-looking versions were finally gone. And by then, it had also begun the gradual process of separation into the precursors of capital and lowercase, so its capital and lowercase shapes ended up separately preserving different aspects of its Phoenician shape. In this sample, there are 37 alphas. They all show the outcome of the first step in the change, which was the loss of the loose ends pointing right in the Phoenician shape. Actually, those are the same lines we see meeting at an angle in the lower left area, but they've shortened enough that they don't cross that top-to-bottom line to the right anymore. But other than that, some of the alphas we see here haven't changed from Phoenician yet at all, while others look more like the standard modern Greek capital, even though they're all on a fraction of one page by one scribe. Each one's top and lower left joints can have an offshoot sticking out from the corner, but those vary in length so much that sometimes they aren't even there. The only area that stays the same is the lower right, which always keeps the offshoot and never becomes a simple angle. The general trend in evolution from Phoenician to Greek is for the original offshoot on top to shrink to nothing, and for the lower left corner to develop an offshoot that it didn't have before. And because this example was written with a pen, you can even picture yourself writing it and recognize how these changes could have happened. At the top, because the left and right sides of the letter were drawn as two separate strokes, their top points were free to drift independently until they ended up in the same place. And in the lower left area, where the corner was drawn with one line coming into the corner and a second line going out from it, the second one tended to partially retrace the first one, causing the angle to pinch together like a zipper. In this transitional time, none of the resulting versions we see here would have seemed wrong, even though some look mostly Phoenician and some look thoroughly Greek. They were just part of the variation that was to be expected for all letters because, of course, nobody made any letter precisely identical every single time. Just based on the usual depictions of its Phoenician and Greek forms, it would be easy to imagine that the way the change had happened was rotation. But in that case, any transitional forms we could find in actual writing from back then would be partially rotated, which they aren't. We do have transitional forms to look at, and that's not the story they tell us. this is. On top of that, the rotation theory invokes a type of transformation that just doesn't happen in these alphabets in general. Some Greek letters or parts of them did rotate slightly, but not that far. And the rotation explanation would only have explained the capital anyway and left the lowercase hanging. But following the actual intermediate forms like this solves all of those problems at once. Another version of alpha didn't lose the top offshoot and rounded off the lower left corner instead of pinching it together. Both rounding and pinching of angles are processes we'll see again in other letters, primarily lowercase letters, but rounding is much more common. You can still see a shape pretty close to this in some people's handwriting to this day, like the white letters at the bottom of this sign. That slight hook at the top, pointing back toward the previous letter in the word, is prominent in the Roman alphabet's usual lowercase. But, as we saw with the capital letter, the whole offshoot from the top could instead get dropped sometimes, which then made it possible to round off the top corner, which gives us the Greek lowercase. And those two distinct lowercase forms give us two different ways we could arrive at a second Roman lowercase. Users of the Roman alphabet switch back and forth between the two lowercases so routinely that we might not even think about the fact that they are different. In fact, not only can different computer fonts use either one, but some fonts, like Times New Roman, even use both without most users ever noticing. The one on the left with a big hook for plain text, and the hookless one for italics. Notice that the red segment in the lowercase also tends to curve at the bottom end. Either end gets pulled toward where the nearest other letter would be in a word. The left end gets pulled left, and the right end gets pulled right. That's because people don't stop moving the pen at the end of a letter, pick it up, move to where the next letter begins, and then put it back down. We move it up and down while going from one letter to the next. And the same rules that affected the development of these lowercases also affected the others. This one loses one of its 3 strokes in lowercase, but people using the Greek and Roman alphabets didn't agree on which one to drop. Here's an example where they did agree on which piece to drop, and they both rounded off the corner that left behind, but in the Roman alphabet, the proportions of the remaining parts stayed about the same, while in Greek we see an example of another general trend that comes up repeatedly: shortening of a letter's beginning stroke and lengthening of the end stroke, which also gives the end more room to curve in. Lengthening and curving at the end of a lowercase letter are so common that I'm naming it growing a tail from now on. Even the Roman lowercase here grew a tail in some manuscripts, but that just didn't end up as the modern standard form, even though it can still show up in some people's handwriting now. Here's one where the Roman version rotated just slightly and rounded off one corner, which results in this letter converging with some others that also have a single vertical stroke and 1 or 2 half loops sticking out sideways from it. Another version of it developed in which the top points of the left and right sides didn't match up anymore, so a bit was left sticking out even though nothing new was added. This is another convergence pattern in ancient Greek. Along with delta, both alpha and lambda also had stems sticking out on top like this back then, even in what we would now have to equate with capital letters. You can see some examples of this in some of the artifacts I showed earlier while talking about alpha, by pausing and looking for anything similar to an alpha that I didn't draw a box around. All 3 of them later lost that top piece in their capital forms, but not necessarily in lowercase. This one isn't used in this form anymore, but it stuck around long enough to lead to a lowercase with the corners rounded off. After that, in Greek, the offshoot on top got pulled toward the following letter as a tail. In the Roman alphabet, it would eventually straighten up and converge into the stick and loop group along with its capital. But some people who were still drawing it in its older, rounder form started adding an extra mark to it to indicate the sound tha, which is now spelled th in English instead of the original da. That created a new letter called eth, which is still used in a few languages. Capital eth got a similar mark added, but the lowercase is more widely known alone outside the languages that use eth, because the lowercase got adopted to represent tha in the International Phonetic Alphabet. The IPA is a relatively modern invention created by linguists to have a single unique symbol for every sound, thus avoiding things like digraphs, homographs, and ambiguity between different languages' spelling standards. The IPA is mostly based on the Roman alphabet, but sometimes uses unusual letters or versions of letters like this, or even symbols that aren't from the Roman alphabet at all, for sounds that there isn't a standard Roman letter for. The next one is xi, another one that grows a tail. It's unusual for pointing the wrong direction, and it's small, but by the time this developed, writers were used to ending lowercases with a little twist, and this was the only way this one could turn because the line it was attached to was already drawn to the right. But the letter also does something else we've seen before in the previous video. Remember the epsilons on this vase, where extra little arches sprouted from the loose ends so the paintbrush did not need to be lifted away from the vase and put back down. Doing the same thing to xi has the same effect, making it possible to draw all in one piece without lifting the pen and putting it back down. Epsilon's capital form has two different things that manuscript writers prefer to avoid, especially in lowercase: a pair of sharp corners and the need to pick up the pen in the middle of the process. Its modern Greek lowercase shows one way to fix both, by rounding off the two corners separately into two separate curves and allowing a small part of the letter to be retraced in the middle. Meanwhile, its Roman and Cyrillic counterparts show different combinations of three other familiar processes: rounding off both corners into one big curve, dropping a stroke at the top, and connecting two loose ends in the same way that we just saw all three connected on that vase. So these are all following the same few rules, just in different ways. Here's one where the original angles are sharp enough to get pinched closed instead of rounded off, like we saw with the lower left corner of alpha. In this case, rounding off the middle angle pinches the ones at the sides, and rounding the ones at the sides pinches the one in the middle. This one also had an angle sharp enough to get pinched together in Hebrew, but we're not talking about Hebrew right now. Its familiar modern Greek and Roman forms are a simple case of Greek rectangularizing and Roman slightly rotating and rounding off. But it also had another Greek form once, which kept the acuteness of the angle and became symmetrical. This alternative capital fell out of use, but not until it had led to a cursive form, which would eventually lead to the familiar lowercase form. It started with another example of a letter's first stroke getting relatively shorter and its final stroke getting relatively longer. That meant it ended so low that, in cursive writing, moving to the next letter without lifting the pen resulted in this new connecting line getting added between the letters. The resulting new angle at the bottom could also be fairly sharp, so the smoothest way to turn the corner resulted in this loop, and the corner loop and connecting line have stuck since then, even in non-cursive writing, even while one of the original pieces was dropped. This form has been adopted in some African versions of the Roman alphabet to represent the voiced velar fricative gha, because there's no Roman letter that comes close, and it's the sound of gamma in modern Greek. Its capital is simply the same shape in a larger size. The lowercase is also the IPA symbol for the same sound. In modern Greek, this would be recognized as a lowercase gamma, but it's more often seen in a form with one more change: pinching the loop closed into a single line, making it coincidentally resemble a Roman Y. Now I'll finish by illustrating some of the more unusual remaining lowercase origins, but just leave the rest, because it's mostly just the same few kinds of changes repeated, with various letters doing various combinations of reducing the number of times the pen needs to be lifted and put back down, growing tails, dropping other parts, especially at the beginning, and rounding off angles or pinching them together. That was all in the Greek alphabet and its descendants. But similar causes also have similar effects in the Semitic alphabets. Hebrew spent a long time being used only in religion, not for all of the other things people could ever do with writing. And in that context, people have more incentive to take the time to make sure that each letter looks precisely the way they think it should look, instead of allowing changes for the sake of speed or convenience. So Hebrew letters have been preserved with very little change in shape from Aramaic, except to make them more consistent and geometrically strict, like European capitals. Meanwhile, Arabic started off with the Aramaic alphabet just like Hebrew did, but was used for everything that anybody would ever write, not just religious texts, which made it more subject to the effects of rushed handwriting that gave us lowercase letters in Europe. So it experienced the same kinds of things that happen in Europe's lowercase letters, possibly even more drastic. That contrast in the development of Hebrew and Arabic letters from the same Aramaic source is so strong that you can even pair up Hebrew letters with their Arabic counterparts and see how most of the pairs look like they could have been a capital form and a lowercase form of the same letter in a hypothetical modern Aramaic alphabet with European-style capitalization. But no style ever developed combining the rushed and sloppy forms and the more strictly conservative forms on the same page like in Europe, so they stayed separate and free from each other's influence. The result is as if there were Semitic capital and lowercase forms, but Arabic writers never capitalize anything, and Hebrew writers never lowercase size anything, like they've all left their caps lock on for thousands of years. And that view of Hebrew letters as essentially all capital helps to explain one big oddity about some of them. The religious setting for all Hebrew writing was a setting where, as we saw with capital letters in Europe, extra bits can sometimes get added just for decoration, even if they slow the writer down. But without a few prominent letters per page contrasting with the rest of the page, any decorations that were going to survive in Hebrew couldn't be those wild, elaborate, psychedelic art shows like in European illuminated manuscripts. They would need to be something you could do every single time you use a letter, or they wouldn't catch on in Hebrew. So this is the decoration we get instead in Hebrew. The tops of vertical lines that would otherwise just end pointing up get these little flags added. They might not have originally been just for decoration. It's not really clear what their origin is. One explanation is that they might have started as a result of brushes or flexible pens bending when they first touch the paper or parchment, or when they're lifted away from it. Another possibility is that they were introduced to make the tips of vertical lines easier to see in styles with very thick horizontal lines but very thin vertical ones, which is especially believable when you look at examples where the vertical lines have practically disappeared and they end up with just these floating detached flags where the ends of vertical lines would have been. Whatever the origin was, they established a style that has caught on even when none of those original reasons apply anymore, and become part of what makes Hebrew writing look like Hebrew writing. So there's no purpose to say they serve now except style. But it's such a prominent style that it's even had an effect on the underlying original shapes of a few letters. In these three, some original parts, which were there all along in Phoenician and Aramaic, end up getting drawn to look exactly the same as the flags that were added to the others. This led to a reinterpretation of these parts of the letters as flags. So, in simplified fonts that take the flags off, those three letters lose one of their original Aramaic parts and get reduced to a single vertical line apiece. But that would make Vav and Zayin, the ones in red and blue, exactly the same, because their only difference with flags was flag placement. So, even in an otherwise flagless font, Zayin still needs to keep something based on its flag just to make it consistently different from Vav. There's also a third category of fonts in Hebrew which don't add any new extra parts and don't take anything away just for looking like a flag either, except that even this kind of font still has to put something flag-like on Zayin to make sure it can't be mistaken for a flagless Vav in the second category. This is the kind of font I'll use in my main table with 22 boxes for 22 letters when I get back to that. Zayin and Vav are far from the only two letters in Hebrew that look very similar to each other. These 7 letters, about a third of the alphabet, ended up as just one horizontal stroke at the top and one equal or longer vertical stroke on the right. But they've stopped one final small step short of becoming completely identical with each other by settling into a system of 2 standard widths, 3 standard heights, and, among the medium height ones, a difference in whether the 2 lines meet in a simple corner or are slightly offset. Notice that the top piece in all of the wider letters here is not just a flag, but in the narrower ones it is. That means that if we switch to a flagless font, only the narrow ones can lose the top piece. The top stays there on the wide letters because it's not just a flag, and also on Zayin so it won't look like Vav. There's also a set of 3 letters that have converged to look like one of the wider ones here, plus one more stroke on the left side, distinguished only by whether that third stroke is detached or offset to the right with a foot at the bottom, or neither. And finally, there's this group of 6 letters which all, at least in some styles, feature a large curve around the right side and bottom, like the lower right quadrant of a circle, probably because a curve in that orientation is the kind that can easily flare out a lot in the hands of a right-handed scribe by twisting the wrist instead of using only the fingertips. The curves in these 6 letters aren't always quite as uniform in all other fonts as in this one, but even when they aren't, they don't all randomly go their own separate ways either. They just break up into smaller groups that still show strong convergence within those groups. For example, any font which changes one of the 2 on the right in some way also changes the other one in the same way, so they both always match each other. And something close to the same kind of thing also happens with the outlines of the 3 letters on the left. In those letters, although they are different at the top and in the center, they can all have the same outline from the right side around the bottom to the left side. In some other fonts, either Shin or Samech can be slightly different from the other 2, but at least 2 of them always have the same outline as each other, if not all 3. Back to the capital and lowercase paradigm. One difference between Hebrew and Arabic letters, which that doesn't account for, is letter rotation or twisting. More Arabic letters are rotated or twisted than are not. The standard change is roughly 90 degrees clockwise, so Aramaic's big downward strokes on the right sides of the letters end up swinging to the left at the bottom of Arabic letters. The only exception is one case I've put in the second row, which had flipped backward at first. It rotated the opposite way because part of it was then interpreted as a tail, and Arabic tails need to be at or below a certain level, not above. These rotations created a dominant horizontal line through at least one version of most letters, along which all of the connections from letter to letter happen. This is an indication that Arabic's twisting and turning was caused by the same pull between adjacent letters that also causes tails to grow. There is at least one other major factor in this as well. Most scribes would have been right-handed, so with an alphabet that flows left, their own right hands would have blocked their view of the line they were working on unless they rotated the page pretty far counterclockwise. Even with alphabets that flow right, right-handed writers often rotate the page a bit, and a left-flowing alphabet just gives them even more reason to rotate it even farther. And writing on a rotated page puts some torque on the letters in the opposite direction, whether the writer plans it that way or not. If they didn't rotate the page like this, then the tendency to draw slanted down and to the left instead of straight left would be so strong that it would tend to make the words cascade down and to the left on the page. This became so common in Central Asia that it became standard practice and created a new style called nastaliq, in which resetting to a high starting point for each new group of letters breaks up the single horizontal flow into a series of slanted ones instead, allowing groups of letters to flow in a different direction from that of the whole line. But we won't deal with nastaliq for the rest of this. We'll just look at straight line Arabic. The connections between letters also created this situation, in which we can see that although most connected groups of letters end with a tail, there is never a tail in the middle of such a group, because most letters have at least two forms, one with a tail for when it's at the end of a group, called the terminal form, and one or more without it for when it's not at the end of a group. There can be up to 4, depending on whether a letter is at the beginning, middle, or end of a group, or standing alone, but it's usually really 1 or 2, with the isolated and terminal forms being the same as each other, and the initial and medial forms being the same as each other. The last thing that needs to be addressed for a lot of Arabic letters in general is all these dots. The Aramaic convergence problem continued in early Arabic, to such an extreme extent that several letters became literally exactly the same shape as certain other letters. Rather than keep the shapes different, Arabic writers decided to start adding dots to the letters to tell readers which one of 2 or more letters with the same shape they meant. In other cases, dots were used to split one letter with 2 distinct sounds into 2 letters, one for each sound. At first, the dots were treated as diacritics, separate from the letters. In fact, it was common to put them in a different color of ink from the letters themselves, so the way your screen looks right now is actually close to the way some Arabic manuscripts looked soon after the dots were invented. However, because there was just no way to make the alphabet work without them anymore, they came to be thought of as parts of the letters. So now, if you change the dot arrangement or remove them, you're not writing the correct letter anymore, and might be drawing something that's not even a letter at all. Now I'll just pick out one word to use as an example of how the dots, connections between letters, and tails all work together. First of all, these are its 8 letters, and immediately you can see that the dominant horizontal line along the bottom is not a separate thing from the letters, or really even a single thing at all. It's made of parts of multiple letters where they flow into and out from each other, and even though this is all one word, it's broken into 3 pieces, with 4 letters in the middle group and 3 in the final group, because the letter Aleph is in there twice, and it can't ever connect to another letter after it. The letter Nun is also in here more than once, but this time 2 of them are connected to another letter after them, but 1 isn't, because it's the last letter in the word, so it grows a tail instead. And finally, here we have 3 different letters that would be exactly identical if not for their dots, which is why the dots need to be there. Most letters of the Arabic alphabet need to be distinguished from otherwise identical letters with dots, or lack of dots, and these come in a few different historical layers with different reasons why the dots were added. In one group, the otherwise indistinguishable letters aren't related to each other, didn't look like each other before, and have completely different sounds, but ended up looking like each other just through coincidental convergence. One pair like that is Ha and Jim, another is Ra and Zain. Ta and Ba without their dots would look the same at all times, and Nun and Ya would also look like them whenever there's another letter afterward to connect with. Similarly, Fa and Qaf would be identical when connecting to a following letter, and when it isn't, Qaf would also be not necessarily identical, but impractically similar to Wa. In another group of letters, each pair originated as a single letter that got split into 2 for 2 similar sounds. Arabic has both Ha and Kha as 2 different sounds, but Aramaic only had Ha, so it had only that letter. So the Arabs left that letter as it was for Ha, but started marking it with a dot for their non-Aramaic sound, Kha, which made its dotted and dotless forms work as 2 letters. And the same thing also happened with the voiced counterparts of both of those sounds. Arabic also had Tha as a separate sound from Da, but the Aramaic alphabet only gave them a letter for Da, so they used that letter for both until they made a new one by adding a dot for the sound Aramaic lacked, Tha. And in this case, the same thing also happened with their unvoiced counterparts and their pharyngalized counterparts, although that last one did also involve a change in voicing and has shifted since then in some dialects. So far, new letters created by adding a single dot on top of an old one for a sound that Arabic has but Aramaic didn't fall into two categories phonetically, which can also be thought of as just one slightly looser category. In the first two, the dot represents shifting the place of articulation for a fricative from low in the throat to higher in the throat or the back of the mouth. In the last three, the dot represents conversion from an alveolar plosive, something we would spell with a D or T, into an interdental fricative, something we would spell with a TH. What both groups have in common is that the dotted version is always a fricative and always in the higher or farther forward place of articulation, more toward the outside of the body, while the one without the additional dot is articulated slightly deeper inside. There's one more letter that was stuck with two sounds in Arabic because Aramaic only had one of them, but it just doesn't fit with these five. Aramaic had an emphatic S, and Arabic had both that and an emphatic Z, so they added a dot to the letter for the emphatic S to create the new letter for the emphatic Z, so the dot simply indicated voicing, at least originally. But that sound also shifted to an emphatic D or eth in some dialects, so the sound in those last two dotted letters have merged into one sound in most dialects now, although different dialects don't all agree on which sound that is. Then there's a letter which already had two different sounds in Aramaic, sa and sha, which Arabic separates from each other by using dots, thus eliminating the Aramaic ambiguity. And finally, there's one more new letter the Arabs added for words that can have either ha or ta as the last sound of the root word just before the suffix if there is one. Rather than switch back and forth between the two different letters in different circumstances, they put the dots from the letter ta on the letter ha to make a new letter that can represent either sound for those words. And that's all for the letters that are used in the Arabic language, but the alphabet has also been adopted for other languages with some sounds that Arabic doesn't have, so some more letters got split using another round of dots. Persian, for example, follows a pretty simple pattern. Start with jim, turn one dot into three, and you get chim. Start with ze, turn one dot into three, and you get je. Start with be, turn one dot into three, and you get pe. Start with kaf, turn one dot into th. Okay, this time there are no dots, but it's functionally the same idea with a bar to create the letter gaf. But that's just Persian. Other languages got the alphabet from the Persians, including these four, and still added more of their own. And for other languages elsewhere, completely unrelated sets of new letters got added instead. And because they often needed to plug the same holes in the original Arabic system, sometimes they contradict each other, like deriving a letter for the voiced velar plosive ga from the letter qof instead of kaf, or deriving one for the voiced labiodental fricative va from wa in some cases, but fa in others. There are more, but they all work the same general way, and there are a lot of them, so I'll just stop here. And the last general topic I'll cover in this episode is a group of similar sound shifts that coincidentally happened in both Greek and Hebrew. The starting point in both Greek and Hebrew was to have not just two sets of plosives like English, but three. Greek's third set was the aspirated plosives. English does have these, but treats them like the same sound as their unaspirated counterparts. For example, in words like people, population, and pepper, we normally aspirate the first P but not the later ones, which makes them all the same sound in modern English, but two different sounds in ancient Greek. Hebrew's third set of plosives was pharyngealized, which is similar but not quite the same because there was also constriction in the throat along with it. Also, as I described in the first video, pharyngealizing a k tends to drag it back into the throat, so it ends up as this Semitic qa, which we represent with a letter Q. So, the big sound shift that happened to a bunch of these is the conversion of plosives into fricatives. The easiest ones to illustrate here are ba and some form of pa, becoming va and fa. This did also come with a small shift in the place of articulation from using both lips to using only the lower lip together with some teeth. But the main thing to pay attention to here is the switch in the type of articulation from plosive to fricative. Instead of stopping the airflow for a moment, we're only squeezing it, so at least some air is scraping through a narrow opening the whole time, which is why the name of this type of articulation is related to the word friction. And although this happened to the voiced sound in both languages, it only happened to the aspirated unvoiced one in Greek and the plain unvoiced one in Hebrew. The same things happen again in the next place of articulation, with da and some form of ta becoming tha and tha. Those are both spelled th in English, but the IPA only ever uses one sound per symbol and one symbol per sound. So it uses the lowercase letter theta for tha and the lowercase letter eth for tha. Next, as you might predict from this pattern, ga and ka become ra and ha. But how to represent these new fricatives in the IPA gets IPA-ish because there are no Roman letters for those sounds. So, for the unvoiced one, ha, we redefine the sound value of the Roman equivalent of the Greek letter. It might feel weird at first to look at a letter X and think ha instead of ksa, but this is the standard symbol for that sound, and it's a pretty common sound outside English, so if you read much in linguistics, you get used to it. And for the voiced counterpart, ra, again we use a letter from some versions of the Roman alphabet which was based on the Greek lowercase letter for the same sound. Notice again that in all three positions, the plain unvoiced plosives in Greek and the pharyngealized unvoiced plosives in Hebrew remain untouched by this effect, so each language reduces to 2 or 3 letters that definitely always represent plosives, not fricatives. In other words, both languages had this happen to 6 different letters, including all of the voiced ones and one of the 2 sets of unvoiced ones, but they didn't agree on which unvoiced set to do this to. And this history also affects how we use some Roman letters. Back when all these sounds were still plosives, the Romans had no trouble using 6 of their own letters for 6 of the sounds when they quoted Greek words, but they didn't aspirate, so they didn't have letters for aspirated sounds, and Greeks' aspirated plosives sounded to them like a plosive followed by an H, so that's how they spelled them, using 2 letters instead of 1. Then, when the Greek sounds shifted to fricatives, the pronunciation of their Romanizations went with them, which is where we got the idea of using these digraphs for the sounds fa, tha, and cha, which would also later end up getting applied to Romanization of Hebrew as well as Greek. This also explains why we don't use the digraphs bh, dh, and gh for the voiced fricatives va, tha, and ra. It's because the Romans never encountered voiced aspirated plosives. Another difference between the Greek and Hebrew versions of this sound shift is that it happened only after vowel sounds in Hebrew but everywhere in Greek. So the original sounds are entirely lost from Greek, but Hebrew still has both the old sounds and the new sounds, just in different positions in words. Hebrew even has diacritics which can specify an out-of-pattern sound. A bar above the letter eliminates the plosive option and forces fricative representation even if it's not after a vowel sound, and a dot inside the letter eliminates the fricative option and forces plosive representation even if it is. But these diacritics are rarely used. Mostly, Hebrew speakers just accept the fact that without those diacritics, some words' pronunciations don't quite match their modern Hebrew standard spellings. And they have another available solution without diacritics for 2 of those sounds anyway, because Hebrew lost all of its pharyngeal sounds. That means teth and kof became just plain unvoiced plosives, the same as tav and kaf had originally been, but they never become fricatives under any circumstances, which made teth and kof the simplest options to remove any doubt when importing foreign words with the sound ta or ka in them. Meanwhile, in Greek, without the old original sounds still existing in the language at all anymore, people aren't in the habit of ever looking at those letters and thinking of their ancient sounds. So when they want to use a foreign word or name that contains one of those sounds which they don't have letters for anymore, they need some other way to represent it. So now they use digraphs for that. And that's it for this video, so the next one we'll get started with closer looks at one letter at a time in alphabetical order.